Welcome to After the War, Reconstruction Begins, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. In 1865, the bloody Civil War came to an end. The Southern armies of the Confederacy surrendered to the Northern armies of the Union, and America was once again a United States. But what happened after the Civil War? How did Americans reunite and form a new kind of union without slavery, in which former slaves were now citizens with equal rights? It wasn't a smooth or easy process. Welcome to the first of 2 tutorials about the Reconstruction era. In this tutorial, you'll learn about the North's goals and aims for Reconstruction. You'll learn about the divisions in the Republican Party that divided Republicans into moderates and radicals, and about Abraham Lincoln's ideas for Reconstruction before his death. Then you'll learn about Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, whose war with Congress over Reconstruction policy was unprecedented in American history. It led to Johnson's impeachment and eventually to a policy of radical Reconstruction led by Congress that transformed the post-Civil War South. And you'll learn about some of the most important achievements of the Reconstruction era, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The era of Reconstruction immediately followed the Civil War, so let's review what you might already know about that conflict. The Civil War began in 1861 after 11 Southern states, seen here in red, seceded from or left the United States. They claimed to be their own independent nation, the Confederate States of America. This led the remaining states of the Union, seen here in blue, to go to war with the Confederacy to restore the U.S. as one nation. The reasons behind Southern secession are complicated, but it was largely motivated by a desire to protect slavery, which had come to dominate the economy and culture of the South. In the North, the abolitionist movement wanted to end slavery completely and immediately, and the newly formed Republican Party, whose political strength was in the North, wanted to restrict the spread of slavery. After Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was elected president in 1860, South Carolina led the way by seceding from the Union. War would soon follow. So would the end of slavery, in a way. By 1863, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a military order freeing all slaves in the rebel states. It was a crucial step toward freedom for African Americans. The Civil War lasted 4 years, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Southerners fought hard for their independence, but by 1865, the Confederacy was spent and defeated. After Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the Civil War essentially came to an end. Only 5 days later, President Lincoln was murdered, assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer. At the moment of its victory, the Union was overcome by deep mourning. What would become of the still divided United States, North and South? The task of reuniting Americans after the war was a monumental one. It needed the talents and wisdom of an Abraham Lincoln. Instead, the nation would need to grapple with the delicate, dangerous post-war period of Reconstruction without Lincoln's leadership. Now that we've reviewed the Civil War, let's set the stage for what came next, the era of Reconstruction. Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877. When the war ended in 1865, there still remained 2 great unanswered questions about the future of the United States. First, on what terms were the 11 rebel states and their citizens to rejoin the Union? Many in the North still viewed them as traitors. Would these states simply be allowed to return as if it were business as usual, or would there be consequences for 4 years of rebellion? Second, what was to become of the millions of ex-slaves, the freedmen, as they were known at the time, in the South? They lacked land, money, and education, and most had known no other lives than that of slaves. Did they deserve all the same rights that white citizens enjoyed? Did the U.S. government have an obligation to help them transition to lives of freedom? These issues would continue to divide America as bitterly during Reconstruction as they had during the war years. In fact, it's somewhat helpful to think of Reconstruction as the Civil War Part 2, the Cold War that began after the fighting stopped at Appomattox in 1865. Reconstruction overlapped with the Civil War itself. In the war's final years, as it became more and more clear that the Union would achieve victory, its leaders began to grapple with the issues of reunification. One question was central. Which part of the government had the authority to reconstruct the Union, Congress or the President? Not surprisingly, President Lincoln, before his death, believed that Reconstruction was the responsibility of his office, the executive branch. Because Lincoln did not live to see post-war Reconstruction, we can only guess at how he might have fully handled it as president. Still, his words and actions offer some interesting hints. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term. He delivered one of the most famous speeches of his presidency, his second inaugural address. Lincoln was already looking ahead toward peace as he delivered these words. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln spoke of healing and charity. He warned against malice, ill will, or vengeance. But he also spoke of firmness in doing the right thing and talked about achieving a peace that was just and lasting. Whatever Lincoln may have believed, he seems not to have been bent on a radical path to Reconstruction. Even during the war years, Lincoln's Republican Party had begun to split between moderates and so-called radicals. The word radical means extreme, and that's what these Republicans' beliefs seemed like at the time, even to many in their own party. Most radical Republicans had long been active in the abolitionist movement to emancipate slaves. They saw in the Civil War an opportunity to thoroughly transform the American South, especially the dynamic between white and black people there. They wanted the seceded states to be cleansed of rebel influences before they could rejoin the Union, and they wanted the freedmen of the ex-Confederacy to enjoy the full civil rights that white citizens were guaranteed under the Constitution. In the early 1860s, these ideas were still radical. Some even saw them in terms of punishing the South for the Civil War. Most Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, didn't consider themselves radicals. Lincoln always considered himself the president of all Americans, North and South, black and white, rebel and loyal. Radical policies risked alienating one or more of those groups. More than a year before the war ended, the president put forth a decidedly moderate plan for readmitting Confederate states into the Union. Lincoln was willing to offer a full pardon to Southerners who rejected secession and accepted the abolition of slavery. They would keep their property, minus slaves, and their political rights. Under Lincoln's plan, if just 10% of the eligible voters in a state accepted these terms and took an oath of allegiance, they could reorganize their state governments and rejoin the Union. Congress found the plan unsatisfactory. Most Republicans, even many moderates, thought that the plan went too easy on the South. Radicals pointed out that the plan didn't include any measures to protect former slaves. Besides, these lawmakers believed that Reconstruction was a legislative responsibility, not the job of the president. So, lawmakers put forth their own plan, called the Wade-Davis Bill, after its two sponsors in Congress. It was both stricter and more radical than Lincoln's plan. The bill required half, not 10%, of voters to pledge allegiance before a state could rejoin. It banned those who had held leadership positions in the Confederacy from holding office in the new state governments. And it guaranteed equality before the law for freedmen. Lincoln found this plan too extreme, at least during wartime. He refused to sign it, which effectively vetoed the Wade-Davis Bill. On other things, Congress and President Lincoln did agree. In January 1865, the Senate and the House of Representatives both passed what would become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment made emancipation official by banning slavery in all of the United States for all time. Although he did not need to, Lincoln signed the amendment as well and wrote the word approved on the document, the only time a president has ever done so. And in his last public speech in April 1865, Abraham Lincoln spoke publicly for the first time in support of suffrage, voting rights, for at least some African Americans. This was a position still considered radical at the time. Even Congress's Wade-Davis Bill had not guaranteed black voting rights. Lincoln's views on race, equality, and Reconstruction were clearly evolving right up until his murder 3 days later. He would never have a chance to put them into practice or to lead the nation through Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln died just hours after being shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, had also been targeted for murder, but the assassin never carried it out. Johnson immediately took the oath of office and became the 17th president of the United States. Andrew Johnson had only been inaugurated as vice president a month before. He had not served during Lincoln's first term. He was a Southerner with humble roots, and he had been picked as Lincoln's running mate because he was the only senator from a Confederate state, Tennessee, who had remained loyal to the Union. In fact, Johnson wasn't even a Republican. He was a Democrat who had joined Lincoln on a national Union ticket designed to appeal to voters of both parties in the 1964 election. Only because of a shocking assassination did a Southern Democrat replace a Northern Republican as president right as the Civil War came to an end. Congress was out of session when Johnson became president in April 1865. In fact, Congress would not officially meet again until December of that year. This created a leadership vacuum that the new president was more than happy to fill. Johnson took it upon himself to create Reconstruction policy, believing, as Lincoln had, that it was an executive responsibility. Like Lincoln had during the war, Johnson wanted Southern states to rejoin the Union easily and in the spirit of reconciliation. But, unlike Lincoln, the new president was a deeply racist man, whose views were representative of many white Southerners at the time. Johnson called black Americans inferior to the white man in point of intellect, and he said they were best suited to undergo drudgery and hardship. Johnson himself had personally owned slaves until 1862. Now, even though he had accepted emancipation as part of the Constitution, Johnson was utterly unconcerned with the circumstances of freedmen. He did not support black suffrage, unlike Lincoln. In 1865, the United States faced a moment of reckoning as to the future of African Americans. And at this crucial time, the White House was occupied by an accidental president who was at best unfriendly to black people, and at worst was a proud white supremacist. Johnson's Reconstruction plan made it easy for Confederate states to return to the Union. All the states had to do was to form conventions that renounced their right to secede and ratified the 13th Amendment. Johnson did not require even 10% of the voters to take a loyalty oath, as Lincoln had suggested. Johnson was willing to pardon almost all ex-rebels, and he ordered all their abandoned and confiscated land returned to them, even though some of it had already been granted to former slaves by the Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency established by Congress. The president was indifferent to the issue of civil rights for African Americans. He allowed Southern states to handle the matter as they saw fit. The Southern states of the former Confederacy reacted to Johnson's lenient policies, quickly following the minimal requirements needed to rejoin the Union. They also took advantage of the president's indifferent attitude towards the status of freedmen. Starting with Mississippi, new state governments across the South adopted laws known as Black Codes, starting in 1865. They were intended to keep blacks legally inferior to whites by denying them important rights to vote, to travel freely, to serve on juries, to own guns. In many cases, black codes borrowed the exact language of nearly identical laws that had denied those rights to slaves before the Civil War, simply replacing the word slave with the word Negro. Some black codes forced freedmen back into the roles they had occupied as slaves, like farm laborers and domestic servants, by penalizing them with taxes if they found other work. Often, black codes declared that if African Americans failed to show written evidence of employment, they could be arrested for vagrancy. Once in custody, prisoners could be leased out to private entities like plantation owners and forced to labor against their will. Convict leasing lasted in the South well into the 20th century. Some historians have labeled the practice slavery by another name. Florida's black codes were particularly harsh. Vagrants could be sentenced to a year of forced labor, and their children could be hired out to others as apprentices. The state forbid white women to live with men of color, anyone who had at least one black great-grandparent, and black workers could be punished for disrespecting white employers. The purpose of black codes was unmistakable. Although they were forced to accept emancipation, most Southern states wanted to recreate the conditions of slavery as much as they legally could. President Johnson did not object to the black codes. He said that states' rights gave Southerners the power to write their own constitutions and laws. With the former rebel states prepared to hold elections and fully rejoin the Union, Johnson considered Reconstruction basically accomplished under his leadership. It's been a pleasure learning with you so far. This isn't the end of the story, but it is the end of part 1 of this tutorial. In part 2, you'll learn about the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. See you soon.